The wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the bitter chill of an unforgiving winter. Elmer's cabin sat on the edge of the vast wilderness like a stubborn sentinel, its wooden beams groaning beneath the weight of frost and snow. He stood at the door, wrapped in a threadbare coat, his eyes narrowed against the swirling gray sky. The land had not been kind to him since the war took his wife, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones like the loneliness that gnawed at his heart. For months, Elmer had lived in silence, the only company the crackling fire and the distant call of a lone wolf. The days blurred into one another, hard labor in the fields, fixing fences, hauling firewood, each task a dull echo of a life he once dreamed of. His hands were rough and scarred, his face weathered by sun and wind, but beneath the gruff exterior lay a man slowly drowning in regret. As twilight deepened, the crunch of hooves against frozen earth broke through the stillness. Elmer's gaze snapped to the faint outline of a rider approaching from the east, a lone figure mounted on a weary horse, trailing a small cart behind. The figure grew clearer, revealing a woman cloaked in worn fabric, her posture stiff with exhaustion. Behind her, two small children huddled close, their faces pale and eyes wide with uncertainty. Elmer's heart tightened at the sight. He had not expected company, nor did he welcome it. Yet something about the woman's determination stirred a long-buried part of him, a flicker of responsibility that he had tried to bury beneath layers of grief. She pulled the horse to a stop just yards from the cabin, the wheels of her cart catching on the frozen earth. Dismounting carefully, she approached the door, her boots leaving deep prints in the snow. Her eyes met Elmer's with a mix of desperation and quiet resolve. "I'm Emma," she said, voice rough from the cold and travel. "These children, they aren't yours. But they need you." The words struck him like a blow, cutting through the numbness that had settled over his soul. Elmer hesitated, wary of strangers and the weight of new burdens. Yet the children looked up at him with fragile hope, their small hands clutching at Emma's skirts. "What do you mean they need me?" Elmer's voice was low, wary. Emma took a step forward, glancing behind her as if the shadows might come alive with threats. "There's danger behind us. We have nowhere else to turn. I don't ask for much, only a place for them to be safe. I can't protect them anymore." A silence fell between them, thick as the snow that settled on the roof. Elmer's eyes traced the line of horizon where the last light of day faded into darkness. He thought of the wife he lost, the life that slipped through his fingers like water. Could he risk opening his door, his heart, to these strangers? The children shifted nervously, their breaths forming tiny clouds in the cold air. The eldest, a boy of 7, stepped forward, offering a tentative smile that barely masked his fear. The younger girl, clutching a ragged doll, peeked out from behind Emma's skirts. Elmer's jaw tightened. His mind raced with the dangers that lurked beyond the tree-line, hostile settlers, bandits, the relentless winter itself. But the thought of turning them away gnawed at him, a quiet accusation from a conscience he thought long dead. With a slow, deliberate motion, he opened the door wider, the hinges creaking like a warning. "Come in. We'll figure this out." Emma's relief was almost palpable as she guided the children inside. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them, a fragile sanctuary against the unforgiving world outside. Elmer closed the door, his gaze lingering on the tracks left behind in the snow, a silent reminder that their troubles were far from over. As the fire crackled, Elmer watched the children settle near the hearth, their small faces illuminated by flickering light. Emma sat opposite him, hands clasped tightly, eyes shadowed with stories she would not yet share. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying whispers of danger and uncertainty. But for the first time in months, Elmer felt a flicker of something else, a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The night deepened, and with it, the weight of the unknown. But in that small cabin, amid the cold and the dark, a new story was beginning, one of survival, trust, and the unspoken bonds that would test the very limits of their hearts. The days that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of survival and quiet discovery. The cabin, though small and weathered, became a refuge from the biting cold that gripped the frontier. Elmer moved with a steady purpose, a man reacquainting himself with responsibilities long abandoned. Emma and the children, Tommy and little Sarah, were fragile threads weaving their way into the fabric of his isolated life, each step fraught with hesitation and guarded hope. Mornings began before the sun's first light, the icy breath of dawn sweeping through the skeletal trees. Elmer showed Emma how to tend the fire, to coax life from the damp wood without wasting the precious fuel. He taught Tommy how to track the faint signs animals left in the snow, and with Sarah in tow, they gathered what sparse roots and frozen berries the land grudgingly offered. The children's laughter, tentative but genuine, was a balm to the cold silence that had long haunted the homestead. Yet beneath these small victories lurked an unyielding threat. The winter was merciless, with fierce storms that seemed to tear at the very earth. One evening, a howl sliced through the night, a wolf, drawn by hunger and desperation. The children clung to Emma's skirts as Elmer loaded his rifle with practiced calm. The shot cracked through the black, sharp and sudden. A tense silence followed before the distant echo of retreating paws faded into the dark. The danger was never far, not just from nature but from men whose cruelty knew no bounds. It was during one such twilight, when the cold seeped through every crack and bone, that the stranger appeared. Elmer spotted him first, a silhouette moving silently between the trees, eyes glinting in the fading light. There was something different about this man, a quiet strength, an unspoken understanding of the wilderness. Without a word, the figure approached the cabin, nodding briefly at Elmer before turning his gaze to the children. He carried no weapons openly, but the weight of survival hung about him like armor. Emma's eyes searched Elmer's as the man settled near the fire, his presence both unsettling and strangely reassuring. They called him Kainoa, though he spoke little, communicating in gestures and measured glances. Over time, his skills became invaluable. He tracked game, read the changing winds, and taught Elmer silent ways to listen to the land. His knowledge was a bridge between the harsh world outside and the fragile sanctuary within. Days bled into nights filled with whispered conversations and shared burdens. Elmer wrestled with his own doubts, the ghosts of loss clawing at his resolve. He caught himself stealing glances at Emma, her strength a quiet defiance against despair. She bore scars unseen, a history that weighed on her shoulders like the heavy coats she wrapped around the children. Together, they navigated the delicate dance of trust, each small gesture a brick in the fragile wall they built against isolation. Tension simmered beneath the surface. The land was not kind, and men were far crueler. Word came through whispered rumors and fleeting shadows that hostile settlers eyed the homestead, greed and suspicion festering like a wound. The threat was no longer just the howling wolves or biting frost, it was human, deliberate, and dangerous. One bleak afternoon, as snow fell thick and unrelenting, a party of men appeared on the ridge, a band of rough-faced settlers with eyes as cold as the winter wind. Elmer and Kainoa watched from the cover of trees, muscles taut and breath shallow. There was no room for negotiation, no place for mercy in their hardened gazes. Back at the cabin, Emma shielded the children, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she whispered prayers into the gloom. Elmer's rifle was steady, Kainoa's knife gleamed faintly in the waning light. The air crackled with tension, every moment stretched thin between hope and dread. The first shot shattered the fragile quiet, a sharp punctuation in the frozen landscape. Chaos erupted as men surged forward, and the small family and their mysterious ally stood their ground. Bullets tore through the air, the roar of gunfire mingling with the cries of the children and the thunder of hooves. Elmer moved with desperate precision, each breath a battle against the fear that threatened to consume him. Amid the storm of violence, Emma's secret surfaced, buried truths spilling from cracked lips. The children were not his by blood, but by the bonds forged through loss and love, they were as much his as the earth beneath their feet. Their father had fallen victim to debts and enemies too fierce to escape, and Emma's flight was a desperate gambit to save what remained. Kainoa fought with the silent ferocity of a storm, swift, unyielding, a shadow no man dared challenge. His presence was a beacon in the chaos, a reminder that survival depended not just on strength but on trust. The battle waned as the attackers retreated, leaving behind echoes of fear and pain. The dawn brought quiet that felt both fragile and sacred. The cabin stood battered but unbroken, the air thick with exhaustion and unspoken grief. Elmer knelt beside the children, brushing snow from their hair, while Emma's eyes met his with a flicker of something new, gratitude, perhaps, or the fragile hope of a future rebuilt from the ruins. Kainoa disappeared into the morning mist as silently as he had arrived, leaving behind a promise unspoken but deeply felt. Elmer's gaze followed the fading figure, a subtle shift in his heart signaling the slow birth of resilience and renewed purpose. In the stillness, the homestead was no longer just a shelter, it was a testament to endurance, trust, and the unyielding will to protect those who could not protect themselves. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, they faced it together, bound by scars, secrets, and the fragile, fierce hope of survival. The story was far from over. The chill of early morning clung to the land like a shroud as Elmer stood at the edge of his homestead, his breath rising in misty clouds against the pale light. The snow beneath his boots was freshly disturbed, tracks not his own, deep and deliberate, cutting through the frost toward the cabin. The memory of the last attack weighed heavy on his mind, the echo of gunfire and shouts still vivid in his ears. But this time, he was ready. Emma emerged from the cabin doorway, her face pale but resolute. The children, Tommy and Sarah, clung to her skirts, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and a fragile trust. The years of hardship had etched lines of strength on Emma's features, yet a quiet vulnerability lingered in her gaze when she looked at Elmer. She stepped forward, brushing snow from her sleeves. "They're coming back," she said simply, her voice steady despite the dread beneath it. Elmer nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders. This land, this life, had never been a gentle place. But now, with Emma and the children depending on him, he understood that survival was no longer just about himself, it was about protecting fragile hope. Kainoa appeared silently from the tree-line, as if summoned by instinct. His presence was like a shadow falling over the clearing, silent, watchful, and unwavering. Without words, he moved toward Elmer, nodding once before disappearing back into the woods to prepare. The mysterious ally had become a silent guardian, a force of nature itself. The sky darkened as the threat drew near. The bandits, rough men with hard eyes and cruel intent, emerged from the tree line like ghosts in the snow, their figures blurred by the swirling storm. They carried the weight of desperation and greed, knowing the wilderness could swallow those who faltered. Elmer's hands tightened around his rifle, fingers steady despite the pounding of his heart. He glanced at Emma, her hand resting briefly on his arm, a simple gesture, yet a fortress against the rising tide of fear. The children huddled close, their small bodies trembling but safe for now. The first shots rang out, sharp and echoing through the frozen air. The world exploded into chaos, gunfire mixed with the crackling of wood, the thud of boots against earth, the cries of men and children alike. Elmer moved with a fierce determination, each breath a battle between desperation and hope. Kainoa struck from the shadows, swift and silent, turning the tide with lethal precision. Amid the storm of violence, Elmer caught sight of a figure moving toward Emma, a bandit with cruel intent. Without hesitation, he fired. The man crumpled, the threat neutralized. Emma's eyes met his, gratitude shining through tears and exhaustion. The battle was brutal but brief. The bandits, realizing their prey would not yield, retreated into the swirling storm, leaving behind a trail of broken hopes and fading echoes. The silence that followed was heavy but profound, filled with the cost of survival. As the dust settled, Elmer gathered the children close, his voice low and steady. "We're safe now," he promised, though the weight of uncertainty lingered in the air. Emma leaned into him, the fragile bond between them solidifying like steel forged in fire. Kainoa returned from the woods, his gaze steady and unreadable. He said nothing but offered a small nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Together, they stood as sentinels over the homestead, a triad bound by trust, scars, and the shared will to endure. Days passed with cautious calm. The wounds, both seen and unseen, began to heal in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Elmer found himself changing, the hardened grief softening into something stronger, a fierce protectiveness, a newfound purpose that filled the void left by loss. Emma's resilience became a beacon, guiding them all through the lingering shadows of fear. Yet the road ahead remained uncertain. The wilderness was vast and merciless, and the men who had sought to claim their home would not forget. But Elmer knew this. Together, they were no longer mere survivors. They were a family forged in fire, bound by trust, and armed with hope. One evening, as the firelight danced across worn faces, Emma spoke softly, "They aren't yours by blood, but they are yours by heart." Her words settled over them like a promise, a testament to the strength found in chosen family. Elmer smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "Then we'll face whatever comes next, together." Outside, the wind howled once more, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, resilience, and the unspoken vow that no matter the storm, they would stand firm. The frontier was a harsh teacher, but from its lessons came a story of survival, trust, and the quiet power of love forged in the coldest of winters. The story had reached a crossroads, but the path forward was theirs to walk, scarred, hopeful, and unbroken. And as the embers glowed softly in the hearth, a new chapter quietly began.